Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. We have Dr. Sean Beienberg back with us. And Dr. Beienberg, today we're talking about the Lodge Bill of 1890. And to be completely transparent, I know nothing about this, yet you say that it's an incredibly important piece of American history. Why is that?
We'll see if you're persuaded, you and the listeners, by the end of this. So I think the Lodge Bill is basically, when it fails, spoilers, is effectively what sets in motion what ultimately becomes basically the rise of Jim Crow. So the little bit of historical backstory, as we talked about in one of the earlier podcasts about Reconstruction, people often don't appreciate, but that Black voting in the South is on par with white voting basically through the mid-1880s. And it starts sort of tapering off as white Southern Democrats start pushing through. Some of it is political, some of it is military violence. But the Bourbon Democratic faction that is running the South originally is mostly like basically business libertarians. And so they're just invested in like working with the North to make money. So they're not that invested in disenfranchisement originally. What eventually will trigger...
And really quickly, disenfranchisement, for listeners who do not know what that word means.
Yes. Removal of basically voting rights. So they're not that worked up about basically who's voting. And so, again, we have this notion, like, as we talked about, Compromise of 1877 supposedly means like immediately like this massive Jim Crow regime builds up, and it doesn't. And because Black voters again and Black Southerners are voting largely on par at the same percentages. But as this starts tapering off, this begins to concern Republicans who become uneasy about what they view as the integrity of voting, both Black voters being unable to vote and potentially voter fraud. Some of which is just ballot stuffing, some of which is white like political machines, basically taking Black voters who are eligible and then basically stuffing their ballots for Democrats, which obviously is not going to be something that those voters can be doing natively. And so the 1888 Republican Party platform includes a line saying, "We hold the free and honest popular ballot and the just and equal representation of all the people to be the foundation of our Republican government, and we demand effective legislation to secure the integrity and purity of elections, which are the foundation of all public authority. We charge that the present administration," that's Grover Cleveland, "and the Democratic majority in Congress owe their existence to the suppression of the ballot by criminal nullification of the Constitution of the United States." So what they're saying is effectively Grover Cleveland is president and Democrats control the House only because the 15th Amendment is being ignored. And the presidential nominee is Benjamin Harrison, who is a Civil War general. So he's somebody that like watched people die effectively for this kind of stuff. So he's invested in this. And so after the Republicans take unified control of the federal government for the first time in a while, they push what's called the Lodge Bill. The sponsor is Henry Cabot Lodge. AP U.S. history folks may remember that name from much, much later when he becomes the critic of the Treaty of Versailles. Albeit, I think much as we'll talk about later, he's more muted than people think. But this is when he's not the big, powerful, most influential senator in the U.S. He's just a young, I don't know if he's quite a freshman, but he's basically a young member of Congress.
Okay.
And so what this bill is it's an enforcement of Article 1, Section 4, which is the fuzzy section of the Constitution that we're talking about again today, which is elections, which the states get to set election laws, but the federal government can set the manner of them. To what extent does that mean the feds can sort of directly operate? What does that power look like? And so Lodge is himself cautious about federalism. So he drafts this bill to mostly be federal oversight, as in like observers, not as in like setting federal policy so much, but basically federal observers of Southern elections. He really wants to make minimal intervention in state politics and federalism, et cetera. Nonetheless, Democrats in Congress, Democrats in the state legislatures freak out. Every Southern Democratic state legislature passes a resolution decrying this. They call it the Force Bill, which recalls Andrew Jackson getting ready to invade South Carolina in the 1830s, right? So, having basically poll watchers, they're equating with Andrew Jackson threatening to militarily occupy them. New York City freaks out. One thing to remember is New York City almost secedes during the Civil War. I don't know if you were familiar with that. New York City is so deeply invested in the cotton industry that they debate seceding and becoming basically like Singapore of America. Fernando Wood, if you watch the movie Lincoln, the character Fernando Wood, who's played by Lee Pace, he's like the most obnoxious of the members of Congress opposing the 13th Amendment. He had been the mayor of New York City.
So New York City, like separating from the state of New York and from the Union.
That's right. Yes.
Yes.
So they're also upset about what they look as this force bill here. Now, Republicans have majorities of the House and the Senate, and they have the presidency. So in theory, if they hang together, they have the votes. But what happens is Democrats use an old school filibuster to buy time. So they don't think they can block it necessarily, but they're trying to run the clock out and buy some time. And they hope they can hold off just enough to peel off just enough Republican senators that it won't have a majority in the Senate. So it clears the House, it's waiting in the Senate. So they buy time, and they do. As I like to say, this is almost like literally a biblical moment, because the senators that flip are the senators from Nevada and Colorado. And basically the Democrats make a deal where they say, I don't want to bore people to death with monetary policy, but they basically cut a deal where they say, we will have the U.S. government buy more silver. And remember, Nevada is nothing. Nevada doesn't even have Las Vegas at this point. It's literally nothing other than like a giant silver mine. It has no purpose.
Okay.
That. So when they say, basically, we will run up the score buying all the silver you folks want to spit out of your Nevada mines, the Nevada senators say, well, we're good with that. Colorado senators do the same thing. So it's almost like literal like Judas pieces of silver. They sell out what had been like their main objective of the party in that election, and they flip and they withdraw their support for the Lodge bill, and it fails. It fails in 1890. And this ends up and Republicans are furious. Democrats are excited. This actually becomes the core of what the 1892 presidential election, congressional and presidential election is about. It's the main issue. The Democratic Party runs what one historian later called the most racist campaign since 1868. The first 3 paragraphs of the party platform decry it as, quote, the most infamous bill that ever crossed the threshold of the Senate. And conversely, the Republicans say, and the language always makes me laugh, we demand every citizen of the United States be allowed to cast one free and unrestricted ballot in all public elections, and such ballot shall be counted and returned as such. Such laws shall be enforced and enacted as will be secured to every citizen, rich or poor, native or foreign born, white or black, the sovereign right guaranteed by the Constitution, the free and honest popular ballot, the just and equal representation of all the people are the foundations of our institutions. The party will never relax its efforts until the integrity of the ballot and the purity of elections is fully guaranteed. And so this is what they're staking the candidacy on. And Democrats say the same. And obviously, Grover Cleveland and his allies win. As we talked about before, they repeal pretty much all federal elections and 15th Amendment enforcements in 1894. Now, in 1892, their winning means that most of the old school, like Civil War era Republicans either retire because they can read the writing on the wall, or they lose. So there's only a few left. And after that 1894 repeal, the rest of them, George Hoare is one of them, William McKinley is another, basically say, like, this is not a winning electoral move for us. We're going to continue to get crushed. Particularly after famously McKinley wins in 1896 without any Southern states. So they just say, look, all this does is lose us Northern votes. It doesn't necessarily gain us Southern votes sufficient to win. So we withdraw. And to the extent that there is any federal election machinery, they're going to point it at Tammany Hall in New York. Because Tammany may be corrupt scumbags, but they're not shooting you when you try to enforce it. And so that moment basically the failure of the Lodge Bill in 1890 and then sort of the 1892 election confirming that is effectively the end of federal efforts to enforce the 15th Amendment for 70 years, 60 years, 70 years. And so that is ultimately what triggers Jim Crow, because in the 1890s, the southern states start basically mass disenfranchisement between like 1895. There's a little earlier for some of them, but basically 1895 to like 1901 is when Black voting in the South is just basically eliminated. And that's what gives you effectively the political, it removes the political opposition to Jim Crow that like Frederick Douglass and others have thought about, which is if Black Americans in the South can vote, they can protect their own rights by voting for state governments that will protect their rights. But after they're all disenfranchised, basically you get your green light to Jim Crow. So nobody really knows about the Lodge Bill's failure, but I think that it's a really, really pivotal moment in American history.
So for listeners who are not familiar with the term Jim Crow, can you give us just a little definition, kind of peek into when we're talking about Jim Crow laws, what does that mean?
Right. So Jim Crow laws are effectively sort of formalized, legalized racial inequality. So segregation is the classic example, and we'll talk about that with Plessy v. Ferguson. But basically de facto white-only voting, although not all whites, because when the Bourbon Democrats realize the deal they can make is they will disenfranchise, because they get freaked out about white populists taking over. And so effectively, how generalizable this is a little, the historians can quibble about this, but effectively the deal ends up getting cut where they say, hey, white populists, would you like to not vote anymore? It means Black Southerners can't vote either. And many of them like, yes, we're good with that. And so white suffrage actually drops significantly as well as a result. So it creates this effectively very almost aristocratic model of governance, but it's reinforced basically by sort of populist pressure to create effectively a really, really clear racial caste system, as John Marshall Harlan will talk about in the Plessy case. So the Jim Crow is basically government operated formal legal inequality and white supremacy.
Got it. And in our next episode, we will be talking about Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a Supreme Court case regarding it. And we actually mentioned it in one of our 14th Amendment episodes. So, Dr. Beienberg, I think you've convinced me. I definitely need to go on a bigger deep dive of this Lodge Bill, but first time I've heard of it. And I'm like, yeah, that actually makes sense. So hopefully you've also gotten the listeners in on your side and wondering about this piece of American history. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.